My people, this video is for those who have already watched Castlevania Nocturne. If you haven't watched it yet, I recommend my spoiler-free review video instead of this one. So guys, how are you? I hope you're doing well. I'm the Monio, the interdimensional demon that talks the most about Castlevania on YouTube, and you're on my channel. The first thing I want to address in this video, and that many are not taking into consideration, is Dracula, who is alive in this universe, since at the end of the first animation he and Lisa are resurrected and end up together, living a happy life. So we can assume that Lisa died of old age after all this time, because she never wanted to be turned into a vampire, and Dracula probably lives in seclusion, without much contact with humans, perhaps at the request of Lisa herself, and this would explain why at the end of Castlevania Nocturne people no longer know who Dracula was. Well, in fact what we saw was that some humans at that time hadn't heard of him, but vampires must have known him very well. In most Castlevania games, it is always related to Dracula, whether directly or indirectly. It is always someone who wants to resurrect Dracula, or use Dracula's power, or some plot that involves Dracula in some way. And taking into account that in series he is alive, I believe they will not miss the opportunity to use the character, even if they decide not to give him an active role in the plot. He should appear at some point in the next seasons. But the Monio, how would Dracula fit into this current plot? Wouldn't it make sense to include him? Well, Alucard could go and meet Dracula, to discover some secret to defeating the vampire Egyptian goddess who is the villain of the current season. That is quite reasonable to think and totally possible to happen. I don't think he will have a very active role in the story, only if the goddess captured Alucard or something, and his father faced the goddess to save him. That I think is unlikely to happen, but it would be really cool. Imagine, the most powerful vampire facing the current villain. Who do you think would win? One thing that we can be almost certain will happen is that Alucard will help the protagonists and eventually face the goddess, but from what has been shown, I don't believe that Alucard will be able to win, as the villain has shown herself to be extremely powerful, being capable of even causing an eclipse, something that even other powerful vampires like Aurochs have judged to be impossible. So I think the threat level she poses is too high even for Alucard, so I think it's quite possible Alucard will try to find some alternative method of defeating the villain. And this could be the chance for other characters to appear in the story, like the Dracula I already mentioned. I think Richter Belmont will still grow as a protagonist in the coming seasons. I didn't expect his romance with Annette, but I think it could be cool if it's well explored, since Annette is one of the best developed characters. Richter, I thought he was a cool character, but he still needs a little depth and a little more charisma for us to care more about him. And I believe that this can be developed in the relationship he will have with Alucard, which in this case, probably it will be a relationship between master and student. Let's remember that this is an Alucard that is much older and more experienced than the one we know in the other animation, and that he has extensive knowledge about magic. In general, Alucard will be a central character, as he will probably have the answers to many of the questions that remained in the first season, about the world, about some characters, and about the villain. Of course, the role of Richter's master could also be played by his grandfather, just Bellman. But I believe that will not be the case, as Richter has just awakened his magic and his grandfather has already said that he is no longer able to use it. Magic. So I believe that Jis will continue to be a recurring character, but that he will help more in advising and revealing secrets of the Bellman family, which could be useful for Richter, as it was already clear in this first season that Jis will not have a role very active in the plot. I believe Maria will have further development in the second season, since in the first season her only conflict was discovering that she had a father, and that he is a detestable person who is on the side of his enemies. But in the next seasons we may have scenes with a greater emotional impact, since her companions left her mother behind. If she has to face her own mother, who is transformed into a vampire, it will be a great moment of conflict for the character and could be very interesting. Aurochs was one of the most interesting characters for me in this first season, because I thought he was going to be just another generic villain, but he managed to surprise me. I think he has the potential to become a possible ally, since it was clear that he doesn't like and isn't loyal to the villain, whether due to conflict of interest or personal motivation, and I don't believe he's going to be killed by Richter. I think it would be more interesting for the story if he died sacrificing himself, and that it's not impossible to happen, since he has romantic ties with another character, but overall I'm very curious to know more about him and his true intentions. For me, and that was the best surprise in Castlevania Nocturne, a very cool character, and I already thought she had a good development in the first season. In the second, I hope they explore even more the mythology of African deities, which is so missing in the Castlevania lore. For example, in the scene where she kills the vampire who enslaved her, she says that he fears the Christian God, and he is weak against his representations, which in this case is the crucifix. So I wonder if this also happens with the other deities, if each vampire, depending on their origin, will have their weakness related to a different deity. I hope this is deepened and explained, as they are good additions not only to Castlevania but to vampire stories in general. A lot of people commented on my other video that they didn't like the villain, that she doesn't have the same charisma and presence as Dracula, and I think she doesn't. But for me, she works very well as a great threat, because the feeling of danger that she goes through is very great. But in fact she wasn't given much depth in this first season, but I believe that was the intention, because she is a character that, in order to work in this plot, needed to be considerably mysterious, to the point of everyone questions whether or not she actually is a deity or something similar and whether she had the power to do what she said she was going to do. So overall I think she's a very functional villain, who doesn't actually have the same charisma as Dracula, but it conveys the feeling of danger and superiority very well, since this is one of the themes of this series, beings who think they are superior to these beings. You could say that conceptually it makes sense, but I understand who didn't like it, and what I expect from her. That's what everyone expects, more depth. Showing the origin of this entity and its past would make things much more interesting. Overall I think the second season will be very promising, especially with the addition of Alucard, who I think will add a lot to the story. I really like the idea of having a super powerful villain who is a mega threat to that world, what already happened with Dracula, but in his case it was a story of mourning, as he never intended to play this role within the story. The problem of having a major threat focused on a single character, which if defeated resolves the plot, is that these stories don't tend to be very long, since the objective is already very clear and defined. So if the story doesn't take other directions, I believe we should only have 1 or 2 more seasons, so that this plot can resolve itself. But what about you? What do you expect from the next season? Leave it in the comments, and subscribe to follow the next videos. Until next time my people, demonic hugs.